Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's xTalk. Today's xTalk is uncovering student perspectives on course concepts. We have tips from an economist and a linguist. And so it is my pleasure to introduce two of our guest speakers today, Nancy Rose and Janis Melvold. A little bit about both of them. Nancy Rose is a Charles P. Kindleberger Professor of Applied Economics, as well as a MacVicar Faculty Fellow here at MIT. I'll also note she is a recent winner of our team's hosted Teaching with Digital Technology Awards, and a visiting scholar at Harvard Kennedy School. And Janis Melvold is a lecturer in comparative media studies and writing at MIT. So they're both here today for their use of two different really strategies and tools. Nancy uses Plickers in her course 1420, and Janis uses workshop-style sessions in 24900. Different strategies, but both in service of trying to engage with their students in class and try to, get to what their students are thinking about and make clarifications as needed. So all that being said, I will hand things off. And just to let you all know, what we'll do is we'll have Nancy present first, followed by Janis, and then we'll have some time for some questions from all of you. So I will now hand things off to you, Nancy.
Thank you. All right. So this is a Plicker, and I'm using slides. It's probably not a particularly effective way to do this, but that's what I'm going to do. Okay. So I'm first going to say, if you were looking for digital technologies in the classroom, you should think digital technologies light. As you could tell from the card, it's not particularly fancy, but I think it's effective in a variety of contexts, and I want to share with you some of the ways that I've used it. I start out by thanking David Otter, one of my colleagues in the economics department, who I think was the pioneer of using Plickers. He used them in a course called 1403, which is one of our intermediate microeconomics classes, to huge success. He's passed that on to a variety of instructors in that class. And at some point, a number of years ago, when I was having a discussion with David about how to increase student participation, he turned me on to Plickers, and the rest, as they say, is history. So the course that I teach is a combination undergraduate and master's level course called Industrial Organization. That's the study of firm behavior in markets. And the course objective that I share with the students at the beginning of term is that the most important skill that I want them to develop is a translational skill, an ability to take models from economics and firm behavior that we observe or is described in news articles or in antitrust cases or in case studies, and develop the ability to have those two speak to one another. So how can we understand something that we observe going on in the world through the lens of economic models? The grading in the class reflects a very heavy weight relative to most economics classes on class participation and discussion. And that's because I don't think you can develop those translational skills unless you've engaged in the discussion. So I spend some time lecturing on models, but then I turn it over to short news stories, excerpts from antitrust cases, excerpts from business school cases, and we try to understand how the behavior that's being described might be explained by the models. And Plickers I have found it a valuable tool for both encouraging and for measuring participation. And also, even if you don't have a discussion-based class, they're a great way to provide instant feedback on whether students are following my lectures or not. So what is a Plicker? I've just shown you what it is. It's basically something that looks a lot like a QR code. If you notice on the card, this is the first card, so this would be student 1 in the class, and the 1 has different orientations, and that's because on the back of the card there are 4 letters, A, B, C, D, and the students are going to hold the Plicker up during lecture when I've asked a question, and they'll orient it so that A is at the top if they choose answer A, or B or C or D. So what do you need to do if you think you want to experiment with this a bit? Go to getplickers.com, print the cards. I had them laminated so I can use them year after year. I distribute them to the students at the beginning of the year. at the beginning of the term. I offer to collect them after each lecture if they're worried they may not remember to bring them to class with them. Then for each lecture that I want to use Plickers for, I generate questions on the website. When I get to a question, I'll have it in my lecture slides. I'll put that up. I'll give students a minute or so to choose their answer to the slide. And then I scan the room with my phone, which has got the Plickers app on it. And so the camera on the phone just goes around the room, records the answers, and the website associates each of those answers with each student. The basic version is free to use. You do have to print the cards, but if you don't laminate them, those are essentially free as well. I will note that there is a maximum of 63 students per class, and that's because when whoever developed Plickers, and I think it was really done more for elementary and secondary education, they had this notion that the typical class would be less than 40 students, the max class would be somehow 63. So if you've got more than that, this is probably not a technology. I love it because unlike clickers, the physical tool that is used in some of our science classes, this is completely free to the students. And I'm always looking for free resources to share with them. I have an open source textbook so it doesn't cost them anything. This doesn't cost them anything. I like to keep those costs and barriers low. All right, so how do I use them? So first I use them to generate discussion. Here's an example of what I did recently. We talked about titanium dioxide, which is a whitener added to paint and I think makeup and a whole lot of products. And it was a case study of how there were a variety of market changes that put one company, DuPont in particular, into a position where it had a substantial advantage over all of its rivals. And the discussion question after we kind of set this up was, what could DuPont do to take advantage of this situation? I had a setup slide that looked basically like this after we had some discussion about what DuPont might be able to do, which said, here's what they actually did. And they announced a massive capacity expansion. They said, we're going to break ground immediately on a new plant that is huge relative to the existing capacity. And our goal, said DuPont, was to increase our capacity share from 1/3 of the market to 2/3 of the market over 15 years. Here's what I did next in class, which was to set up this Plickers question. So I asked them, does this announcement likely reflect preemptive investment to deter entry or expansion or reinvestment by rivals? This is a concept we'd spent the earlier part of the lecture talking about models of entry deterrence. Is it alternatively investment to take advantage of the substantial economies of scale and expected growth in the market that DuPont enjoyed? Or do they think that there was something else explaining this? Now, given what I discussed in class, I expected kind of most students to choose A or maybe some combination of A and B and answer C. But I always get some that think, yeah, you're pointing me toward this because we've just talked about entry deterrence, but I really like answer B. And so what I can do with Plickers after I've surveyed the class and seen kind of what the split looks like, some of my colleagues match the student answers and say, Nancy, you've answered A, tell me why. I tend to not like to put quite that much stress on students, but I find that if I just say, someone who chose answer B, explain to me, what you were thinking, why you chose that, why you think that's an appealing answer. And the fact that they have already committed to that answer by holding up their Plicker card, and that they're seeing, some significant number of their classmates also choosing that answer, gives them, I think, a little more comfort in being willing to raise their hand and say, here's why I chose that answer. In a question like this, where I typically get a split in the class, then I can ask someone who chose answer A to explain why they didn't think B was the dominant explanation, and we can get a dialogue going back and forth among the class. So as I said, I find it a nice way to sort of give them permission to weigh in, and by something as simple as taking ownership just by choosing which letter they're going to answer on the Plickers, it seems to make it easier for them to volunteer. The second way I use Plickers is to assess translational skills. I told you that was the most important objective in my class. So here's an example of how I might do that. I spent a couple of lectures talking about various models, economic models, of firm strategic price setting. and explained how those models illustrate a variety of different pricing strategies, forms of price discrimination, variation based on consumer search costs, cost-based differences in pricing. And I'm interested in trying to understand, now that we've talked about these models, can students use them to identify what might be happening in a particular application? So in this case, I might give them something like an excerpt from a news story that talked about the introduction of basic economy airfares. The graph on the right is telling us about various restrictions that are associated with basic economy across Delta, American, United, three of the major airlines. And then I'll say to the students something like this. I'll throw up the Plicker question, and here I'll say basic economy airfares reflect a strategy of, and I'll give them, again, maybe in this case, 3 specified choices and a 4th that lets them kind of free form or free associate. And in this case, the answer that I'm looking for as the most likely explanation is B. I tend to get, because we've spent some time talking about this, most students settling on B. But again, if I don't see that, if I don't see them being able to connect the way that the airlines are imposing restrictions on these tickets that make it less attractive to a group they want to sell high price tickets to, and they answer one of these other questions, I can probe to say, why do you think that's the case? And either settle on maybe there wasn't enough information in the previous slide, or they saw something that kind of the rest of us or I didn't see in that. But this is a way that when I kind of do check-ins on this, it helps me to understand, are they seeing connections between the models and the stories of what's going on in the world? Then the third way that I use Plickers, and this is something that as I mentioned at the beginning, I think anybody can use whether or not you have discussions in your class. I found this to be a quite helpful way to improve my lecture qualities, is to use them to get real-time feedback on my lecture. So to assess, I've just finished, for example, here is something where I spent 15 or 20 minutes walking through a model of how 2 firms might compete in quantity choices, something economists call Cournot competition. There's a lot of math in that. So I'm setting up profit maximization, I'm deriving first order conditions, I'm solving for best response functions, which tell us how firms are going to choose quantities as a function of what they expect their rivals to do, and then solving for equilibrium. So it's, pretty math heavy, not a lot of discussion in that. I then introduce a new concept, something called strategic substitutes. So the bottom part of the slide is basically lifted from one of my lectures. And the question is, have students followed this at all? So, did I lose them? Are they with me? So I might ask them something like this. I've set up in the previous slide this best response function for firm 1 and firm 2. And now I say, what happens if firm 1 lowers its costs of production, its incremental costs of production? And I give them 2 choices with a picture for each associated with each choice. One is that firm 1 is going to shift outwards. So for any quantity of firm 2's output, it's going to produce more. The other is that firm 1 is going to shift its best response inwards. So for any quantity Q2, it's going to want to produce less. And that's going to help me to diagnose whether students have kind of followed the model and the intuition for the model and how it works. In this case, the correct answer is A, that it shifts it outward. If it's got lower costs, it wants to produce more. And then I follow that up with a second question, which is, tell me how quantity changes in equilibrium after we see this marginal cost fall. And so that's just asking them now to take this new best response function and find the equilibrium point and realize what that implies about the relative movements in firm 1 quantities and firm 2 quantities, to kind of cement this idea that if firm 1 is producing more, firm 2 is going to want to produce less, that strategic substitute concept that I just mentioned. I do this not in every single lecture, but if it's a model intensive lecture, I often like to do something like this kind of midway through or after I've developed a chunk of modeling exercise, again, so that if it turns out I'm getting a big split in this, these are questions where there are right or wrong answers, and I'm getting a split, it tells me I need to go back and try to articulate and explain in a different way, or to diagnose where it was that students didn't follow what I was doing in terms of the derivation. And I'd much rather learn that I've been unclear, when I can course correct immediately, than waiting for a problem set or an exam to tell me that. And I find often students, even though I encourage a lot of discussion in my class, are still pretty shy about putting their hand up and saying, I just don't follow what you're doing. Also, they may think they follow, but this is going to tell me, is what they think they're following actually consistent with what I'm trying to teach? Okay, bonus, last thing I'm going to say is, the other fun thing I do with these is at the beginning of my class, the first lecture, I have a series of kind of short, what I call vignettes, 1 or 2 slides from a news story. In the first lecture, I use those to introduce some topics that the course is going to cover. So I might, for instance, this semester I've had a news story associated with the Google search antitrust case that's now being heard in the DC Federal District Court to come up with some remedies to Google's monopolization behavior. It might be an example. I do that kind of stuff in the first lecture. In the last lecture, I use these vignettes to kind of do a recap of some of the topics that we've covered in class with the news story or the example that's an application. And I do it in a quiz show format where students can vote for their favorite answer. And I like this because hopefully at the end, it illustrates to all of us how much they've learned, that they can see something like Hyundai's 10-year introduction of a 10-year warranty. And I can say, is that an example of smart advertising or various uses of signaling product quality changes? And if we're all on the same page and students have learned as much as I hope they do, their answers to these questions are going to tell me, yep, I've got that. And I think that can be very, very rewarding as a faculty instructor to know that that yes, they're walking away with some knowledge that hopefully will stick with them. But also, I think it's rewarding to the students to feel like this is how far I've come. That initially these just seemed like a blur of news stories that I wasn't sure how to think about them. And now I've got tools to really understand why a company might choose to do something like this. So that's the way I use it, and happy to take questions when we get to the question side. Thanks.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk about the writing workshops that we use in a 21W or 24900 linguistics course. So I want to talk about, first of all, in sort of setting the framework for this, to just talk first about what writing workshops are and then how they fit into the context of the courses in the communication requirement. So writing workshops, I would define the way we use them is that they're a pedagogical tool for teaching the rhetorical elements and key principles of an academic genre in writing, where specifically where writing instruction is embedded in a disciplinary subject. And I know that many of you are very familiar with the MIT communication requirement, but for those of you who are not, I think this is important sort of background to see how this is the sort of the context for how these workshops are used. So briefly to review this, MIT has a communication requirement requires of all freshmen or of all undergraduates that they take 2 CIH courses at a minimum, 2 communication intensive courses in the humanities, or 2 following that, a minimum of 2 CIH courses in their discipline, in their major. And for about roughly 30% of incoming freshmen, based on their performance on the summer freshman evaluation exam, they are required to take for their first CIH course a CIHW, which is a standalone foundational writing course. And I want to emphasize these are not remedial courses, but they are dedicated standalone courses with a maximum of 15 students in each course that gives students that need more intensive work in the transition from sort of high school writing to college level academic writing, a stronger foundation for going on into a CIH and CIM. So the basic sequence is what I have represented here, that students typically will take a minimum of 2 CIHs before they turn to taking courses that are more deeply embedded into the kinds of writing and genres that are reflected in their own major. So the course that I'm going to be talking about is a CIH, and so I wanted to first review sort of what some of the main intended outcomes are for CIH subjects. And students are asked to gain experience with a variety of academic genres in these courses, to practice expository writing and oral communication, to learn to develop and structure persuasive arguments, to improve clarity in their writing, and to learn the principles of source use and citation. Because the writing instruction in these courses is embedded into a subject course, a course in a certain discipline, there are different ways that course instructors who opt to have their course become a communication intensive course, different ways in which communication instruction can be provided within a given class. And this is worked out between the faculty and the RAP lecturers that are working in that class. And it may involve, this is what I see as some of the pieces in our toolkit, are that there may be occasional in-class instruction or presentations that might occur during a lecture or during a recitation section, for example. Many of the CIH courses rely heavily on individual conferences, one-on-one between the RAP lecturer and students. Workshops is another that I've been working on a lot over the past few years. And also another type of approaches to offer what I call guided peer review sessions, in which students bring in drafts of papers that they're working on and are taken through a process in which they can offer feedback to other students on those papers. And in that process, not only the author of a paper gets valuable feedback, but in the process for students that are offering the feedback, it gives them a way of thinking about developing a critical eye for looking for strong and weaker elements of a paper. So turning now to the particular course that where I teach writing workshops, and I want to also mention that 2 of my colleagues have joined us here, Atisa Banu-Azizi and Elena Kalestinova have worked with me in 24900 in providing instruction through workshops as well, and have helped to improve the materials that we use. So in 24900, it's Introduction to Linguistics, and typically this is a course that it's held both fall and spring semesters every year. And in the fall, it typically has around 90 to 100 students. And in the spring, it typically has around 60, possibly 70 students. There's a sort of a group of faculty that typically teach this course, and it's rotated among, so that we become familiar with the faculty that we're working with. There are 3 specific academic genres that are taught in this course, and each of those is reflected in a particular writing assignment. So one is a critical summary. It's what we usually start out with, and it's a critical summary of a linguistics-related article. The second is a research report that is based on students' fieldwork, research, investigation of a language of their choice, in which they have the opportunity to apply concepts that they've learned from the linguistics course to investigating a language and its properties, its phonological properties, morphological properties, and syntactic properties. And they do this by working one-on-one with a native speaker of that language, with sort of the imaginary scenario that they are the first person to work on documenting this language. And so this in itself, this assignment, I have to say, is one that engages students very actively in learning by applying through this process the concepts that they're learning in the course. And just as an aside, I'll also mention that in a poll a couple of years ago in the fall class, we found that there were 45 different languages that students had selected that they were working on. And the third and final assignment is a research proposal that grows out of the research report. It's a sort of brief research proposal in which they identify an unanswered question from their research report and describe that question and how they might approach answering that, what kinds of data they would need to answer that question. So those are the three assignments. And for the writing workshops, we provide workshops for each of those three assignments, and we offer 2 sessions for each of the assignments on different days and times to try to accommodate student schedules so that they maximize the chance that students that want to come can do that. Attendance is optional. It requires an additional time commitment from students to come. But the materials from the workshop, which usually involves detailed slides as well as some handouts, are always posted on the course Canvas site after the second workshop. So the format for the workshops involves both instruction and active engagement. So typically we first provide an overview of the purpose, the target audience, the main elements, and the structure of that particular type of paper, that genre. And that's followed by a more detailed explanation of the main elements. And that also then includes analysis and assessment of samples. And that is sort of interwoven with the detailed explanation of the main elements. And this is where the active engagement comes in, that I have found over the years, the more I've taught, the more I've come to realize the value of giving students concrete samples to look at. And not only that, I think at the level of CIHW and CIH classes, that using samples that are actually of that assignment and with other students' work, rather than professional samples, is valuable to them in seeing what is expected and what's for that particular assignment. I'll say a little bit more about that. So the samples that we use, they always represent the same assignment from that class. And they're excerpts from previous students' work, and they're always borrowed with permission from the writers. So I'll illustrate just a couple of examples of how we do this in the workshops. So one example is for the first writing assignment, the critical summary. One of the aspects of critical summary writing that we give a lot of emphasis to is how to set up, to introduce, to frame that essay, which requires being able to extract sort of the overarching ideas in the piece and to separate that from the more detailed summary that follows. And also to be able to establish a clear central thesis, an arguable thesis, because this is a critical summary, not just a summary. So there's a main idea that should appear as a result of their analysis and assessment of the author's central claim. So as an exercise, what we do is show them and take an example or two of introductions to this for this assignment, but from a semester in which a different article was used as the basis for the critical summary. And then to raise the question, are all of these elements that we've gone over, are they present in this introduction to this critical summary? And how is this introduction structured? And here's an example of one that we've used. And so what typically we will give them a hard copy, pass around the hard copy, is to give them some time to look at it. They can mark it up that way instead of just looking at the screen, and often have them spend a few minutes talking with the partner, somebody next to them, before we discuss the piece as a whole group, and just pointing out some things, noting this down, and then resuming together as a group to talk about what they came up with. Following the discussion, we present something like this, where we can color code. And this was obviously a very strong example, where you pretty easily identify each of those 4 elements and see how they were structured in this way. So another example we use is from the research report from investigating a language. And one of the important elements that we emphasize in that, because they've collected a lot of data from their working with their native language informant. And so they have a lot of data that relates to the phonological properties of the language, the morphological properties of the language, and the syntactic properties of the language. And we emphasize that in presenting those in a report, that the best way to do this is to pull out of their data a set of claims to show the data that supports each one of those claims, and then to present their analysis of that data that shows how it supports that claim. And one of the things that we've noticed most often, one of the tendencies is that students will overlook the analysis portion and think that making a claim and showing the data is sufficient, that it should be clear to the reader how that data supports it. But we emphasize the importance of providing the analysis of how that data is linked to the claim. So that's why we go through this spend a lot of emphasis on this in the workshop. So in exercise, we would pose the question, giving them a sample excerpt from a student's paper, asking, does this example include all 3 of these elements? How is it organized? And does the analysis clearly show how the data support the claim? So here's an example from a student who was doing work on Turkish. And the claim that they made regarding the syntax of Turkish is, you can see here, Turkish is a head final language in contrast to English, which is head initial. And then they explained what that means, that the head of a syntactic phrase in Turkish is always follows its complement. And then they present, here's an example of data that they present to show that. And then here's their analysis. They show the actual detailed tree structure of the sentence, and say, we can see from this tree structure the representations that that the lexical heads, this is important to the notion of headedness, that lexical heads, prepositions, verbs, and nouns always follow or come last in the phrase. And it's interesting to note that this student then builds on that by pointing out something that they've established that generalization, but then see something in the data that looks puzzling. And so they may actually make a claim that there's a kind of ordering of the phrases themselves that are don't seem to follow any obvious pattern. And so they go on to show that, to present evidence after that of that, the different orderings, and attesting to the fact that their native speaker said that there was no difference in the interpretation of those. So then, based on this example, we would have students analyze, going back to those questions, is the claim clear? Is the data clearly linked to that claim? Is it sufficient? Is the analysis of the data sufficient to show that it does support that claim? So our writing workshops are still, even after many years, a work in progress. There are both advantages and limitations to them. The advantages that I see in particular are an opportunity for group analysis and discussion of these samples. It's more efficient than simply one-on-one conferences alone, although we always offer individual conferences to students who request them. And students may do that because they're unable to attend one of the workshops and have questions even after looking at the materials, or sometimes students, even who have attended a workshop, still have some questions that they want to follow up on. But what we have found is that the more effective the workshops are, the fewer individual conference requests that we have. It also allows students to raise questions in this sort of group forum, and that's typically the kinds of questions that they raise are likely to be things that other students are wondering about, so it's a chance to address these issues in the whole group. The limitations are that attendance is rarely more than 50% of the class at any given workshop over the semester, that no more than 50% of students will attend a workshop over the course of the semester. And another limitation is that on one hand, we want to keep the length of the sessions fairly short to an hour, no more than an hour and a half, but try to cover quite a bit of material in that kind of time. And so there's a sort of tension there. And I think we haven't decided even whether ideally they are an hour long or an hour and a half long. So this is something that we still are thinking about. Going forward, some additional issues to consider about the workshops and some other ways of possibly expanding this as a way of engaging students in the communication component of this CIH course, is a question of whether we should offer these as both in-person and online. And we haven't absolutely resolved this. It's still under discussion. At the moment, we're holding them in person. I like having students in the classroom and face-to-face, but this is something we're still considering. Another is whether we might be able to offer additional types of workshops. Some possibilities include a forum where they can discuss the articles that they can choose from for the critical summary essay, or group writing sessions, what I call in the CIHW class I teach, I call this writing club, where there's a dedicated time for them to spend writing so that they never end up, ideally, where there's a assignment due in 2 days and they haven't started on it. The idea is that that situation can be avoided by offering time for them to actually work on writing. And also, we want to research the effects of workshop attendance on the quality of writing in order to assess the value of this as a pedagogical tool, and not simply whether the overall quality is improved, but even what aspects of their writing we may be seeing effects on or not. So this is another aspect of this that is something that we are thinking about going forward. Thank you, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you both, really, for those great presentations. I have to say, I find it kind of fascinating that I think despite what you've described as being very specific to each of your unique disciplines, there's some common patterns, right? And so, one of the things that I thought was really interesting was that you're really both trying to, in a way, like lower the barrier for students to actually participate and share some of their work or thinking. And in a way, it's both translational, right? Like for Nancy, in your class, it's, partly about how they can apply the models that they're learning to some other real life situation that they're learning about. And in Janis' case, you're looking at, can students identify structural elements that they're learning about in writing in things that they're reading, and can they apply that to their own writing? So, I just really enjoyed hearing both of your perspectives for those reasons. One thing I'm interested in, and anyone who has a question, feel free to chime in, raise your hand or just let me know if you have a question. do either of you have some insight onto how students, how they are perceiving these experiences, like any student feedback from surveys or other input from them?
Well, I'll jump in to say, I might have a year ago said I don't have a lot of feedback. I don't want to overstate this, but I was surprised and gratified to see that at least some students or set of students in my class from last year thought that this was valuable enough that they nominated me for this digital teaching award, which is a student nominated award. So some of them found that. I think that probably has made me more aware of assessment of this technique, but when I did my mid-course feedback, I do a kind of, few short questions, what's working, what's not, what do you like, what would you like to see changed? And I did get 2 or 3 students who called out specifically the use of Plickers and the fact that it made them feel more comfortable in participating. So I don't want to overstate it and say that all of the students find it to be particularly helpful, but at least some do. And certainly my sense is relative to when I used to have students vote, like back in the old days, pre-smartphones and everything else. I used to have students vote answers to questions. I had to have them put their head down because they wouldn't raise their hand. They'd be like looking at each other, thinking about were they going to raise their hand. This gives them a little bit of anonymity, at least to their peers. But I do think, as I said, and maybe I'm over, psychoanalyzing this, but I do think the fact that they've answered then makes them a little more comfortable to tell me why they answered the way they did. So some little bit of feedback on that.
Yeah, I've been gratified by students who have commented. This is just sort of anecdotal. It's not a sort of study on, students' response to the workshops, but I've had students comment on how helpful they found the workshops and the materials that we provided. But one of the projects going forward is to actually do more to investigate this, to see what students what their experience of the workshops are. I would say that one thing I do notice is that in looking at the papers for each of the assignments, that it's pretty easy to detect those who have not, if not attended a workshop, even haven't looked at the materials that we posted on Canvas, that you can see that they have missed out important elements that we have taught through the materials of the workshops. That is pretty clear. But there's a lot more that we want to do to try to understand the ways in which and the extent to which the workshops are effective. I would say that a lot of what we're doing right now is sort of going on faith. I would say that for the workshops, my focus right now would be on sort of building on what I said previously, would be to do more to understand what's working well or less well with these workshops, which would require some systematic sort of study of research on the effects of the workshop, both on just students' feedback on their experience, but also looking at the comparing the results, let's say, of students that have attended workshops and those that are not, to see whether we can improve, to maybe even to sharpen the focus of the workshops in ways that are more effective. And as I said, also at the end of my talk, of thinking about ways that we might even be able to expand them into other, in addition to offering workshops that are specifically focused on the 3 genres that we're teaching, but other things like reading, critical reading, and actual drafting and writing. But in the work, I would say that if you're to look at the workshops that we offered 10 years ago and now, there's been a lot of change and I think improvement in the way that a lot of improvement in the way that we've done this. And they're just a continuous work in progress. So, but I think we're at a point where having more research on the effects of these is going to help us figure out the next move.
Yeah, so in thinking about the answer to that question, I was going to go kind of exactly where Janice ended up just before her last comment, which was, I can think back to how I used this tool at the beginning, which tended to be much more about assessing our students kind of tracking with me during the lecture. So the type of question I put almost at the end of, here's the model, what would this change predict about, how that would feed through the model. So really much more specific about, do you understand in the moment? As I realized that, in fact, some of my more open-ended questions, or not, I wouldn't say open-ended because you're stuck with these 4 choices is all you can give them, but the questions that are more designed to kind of tee up the discussion, as I realized that those seem to be effective in generating kind of more volunteers willing to raise their hand and say, here's why I think this. I've added more of those into a number of the lectures. I will just admit to you that I start with the best of intentions each semester, that I'm going to look through my material and think about new materials, because my Plicker use tends to kind of dampen off as the semester goes, and then there's a little bit of a jump at the very end. And I, every time at the end of the semester think I didn't do that as kind of holistically as I wish I had. So at this point each semester, I'm saying I'm jotting down some thoughts so that next semester I will have more of these kinds of questions kind of teed up. The other thing I didn't mention is that for many of my discussion topics, I assign these very short readings, and then I have them submit a paragraph or 2 of their digestion of the readings before the class, so that, most of this is not coming at them, as the first time they see it is in the class, or even just, I've hoped they've done the advanced readings, because I've learned that's a hope that is almost always dashed, if there isn't some accountability. And so I'm also trying to figure out how to integrate the Plickers questions to not be exactly what I've asked them, but to be more complementary to what I've asked them to reflect on. Ambitions, always ambitions, lots of room for improvement.
Nancy, do you find students are more likely to select some of the sort of pre-worded responses as opposed to like the option D of like explain other? Like, what is your general experience with that other category? I'm curious about that.
I'm sure that it varies tremendously on how thoughtful I've been in spanning the possible answers. They always surprise me that they have ways of thinking about things that I hadn't thought of, and sometimes quite valid, but it's just I'm so used to thinking about it in a particular way, it didn't occur to me that, perhaps their favorite answer isn't in A, B, or C. Usually, though, I find the others are when they're agonizing over a couple of the choices. And so when I say, the 5 of you who picked other, somebody tell me what you're thinking of here. It's often, well, I think it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And, honestly, that probably is a correct answer. How much is on the weight may vary, and I tend to look for, which do you think is the more important? But yeah, I think it's sometimes they've seen something I haven't seen. Sometimes it's, I want to be able to check multiple boxes, and I can't with the Plicker, so I'm picking other. And it varies, but they're often interesting discussions.
If you don't mind me asking, is there a reason why the workshops are optional?
I think we're required, since they're being offered outside of class time, I am pretty sure that MIT regulations would not allow us to require it. And unfortunately, it would be at least 8 hours or 8 sessions of lectures if we were to hold these during the course, which would be a huge chunk of the actual course content that faculty aren't going to be willing to give up for this. So this is what we're left with. And there's an interesting, we've noticed some differences that I can't explain in the attendance. At some semesters it's been quite high, relatively high, close 50, even close to 60%. And others much lower in ways that I don't understand. And I think that we can do more to figure out how to convince students that attending these is actually going to make, spending the time in the workshops is going to probably, their experience will be that writing the essay is going to be a lot, or the research paper is going to be a lot easier because they're going to have more confidence in what they're doing. But again, one of the issues is, would we get more attendance by holding these online? Is there a drawback to holding these online rather than in person? And this is one of the things that we're actually thinking about.
I think we're actually just about at time, so I will say this will be the end of our talk here today. But and this is actually our last xTalk for this academic year, so hopefully see some of you back again in fall when we kick things off for next academic year. And thank you again, Nancy and Janis, for all your time in presenting today.